No musical introduction to this one. Doesn't feel right in many ways because of a lot of things that are happening in the world. Palestine by Joe Sacco. Now, I went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth for weeks about whether or not to talk about this book, mainly because 4 days before the atrocities in Israel happened, I started reading this. I was at the precipice of getting through like chapter 6 or 7 of 9 chapters in the book, and all of hell broke loose really in Israel and Palestine and Gaza and all that type of thing, and still continues to. And it's absorbed my attention like it probably has many other people, because it is such a difficult subject in many ways. And I went back and forth whether or not I should talk about this book, because ultimately I didn't want to be seen as kind of, taking advantage of a situation to try and self-promote myself or the channel. But then I thought to myself, ultimately, the one thing that's really lacking, because again, I'm just absolutely absorbed by reading stuff. And again, I'm a historian, so I love delving into the history behind things. And I think a lot of the answers that we seek in life can be found by looking in the past. And so I thought, I'll talk about it, because ultimately I think the one thing lacking with everyone at the moment is education on the whole situation, on both sides of the conflict, on both sides of the occupation, on both sides of the country's founding, on all of that type of thing. I think education is key to finding a middle ground and an understanding. And for me, in Wales, in this kind of privileged position of being so separate from the atrocities going on in the world, I'm kind of in a privileged position where I can take time to try and understand it and to try and figure out, how I feel and how and my opinions on it all. And books like Palestine help influence that, because graphic novels in many ways do things differently to other literature and other prose books and stuff like that. They can really reduce complex stories and narratives down in many ways, elevate them in many ways as well. And Palestine by Joe Sacco helped me to understand a bit better Palestine's plight in all this. And I will say that right from the beginning. Joe Sacco in this book, right at the very end, when he's talking to an Israeli Jewish woman, she puts across an opinion about Joe, her hoping that he displays, a level, pragmatic argument presenting both sides. And he was like, no, I'm not. Because ultimately, when he wrote these 9 issues that combine into Palestine in 1992-93, he was in search of the other narrative that he didn't know. He felt that he knew the Israeli narrative and the side from their perspective and the conflict from their perspective. But what he didn't understand is why even the name Palestine and Palestinian would invoke, terrorist ideas in him as an American. And so he was actively looking to redress that balance, to understand Palestine's and Palestinian communities better. So this book is 100% one side of this vast story. One author looking to understand Palestine and Palestinians, and in particular the Gaza Strip and all that, better. If you do want a more balanced, kind of more straightforward look through graphic literature on the whole Jewish perspective, then the Jewish Books Council, I think it was, or something similar, they've got a great page on their website that I'll put a link of in the description below, that gives you a lot of books from the Jewish perspective, and all graphic novels, obviously, because it's the graphic novel channel, but they're all stuff, many of which you probably read, many things, 1 or 2 things I know I'll be doing a video of in the coming weeks and months, because again, I've read them recently without really realising the amount life was going to change in October and all that. This is published in Britain by Jonathan Cape. I've got a very bruised and battered paperback version of it. And it really reinforces how good Joe Sacco is in getting across these very complex societal issues. And, he's an expert, I think. I really love and admire the work Joe Sacco does. This, however, is a very different Joe Sacco. It's early on, it's 1992 when he's writing this. And so he goes to Palestine with the intention of trying to find out who Palestinian people are, why they're angry, what the occupation of Palestine is, all that. So keep that in mind as well, that this is 1992. The political situation, social situation, a lot of things have evolved and changed since then, but this book is still relevant because it can still give you an idea and an indication of the things leading up to the situation where we are now, modern day, really. So this book, as Joe said in his foreword, is about the first intifada against the Israeli occupation, which has changed slightly now. And he wrote it after spending 2 months in the occupied territories. Why is it different, Joe Sacco, though, is this book, the writing for a start. The writing is approached very differently. Now, when you start reading it, there's almost kind of a cockiness to Joe's writing. They might put you a bit off, or it might kind of think, what's he doing? Why is he writing like this? But as you go forward through it, you realise that he's very uncomfortable with writing on the situation. He realises quite early on that he's gone in search of tragedy, and he feels almost like he's exploiting the situation for his own ends. And he's struggling to balance, his journalistic integrity, him doing this to try and get that word out there, to try and change life out there in some way, and try and get this underrepresented opinion out there in the mainstream as much as possible. But then equally, he's very uncomfortable with it. So how he approaches writing is he gets this veneer of, cockiness and sarcasm, and so when he's talking to some people and they telling a story of woe, he goes, oh well, that's not sad enough, I've heard about 1 million killings, 1 million rapes, 1 million this, where's the juicy stuff? And he's after that. It works on multiple levels, I think, this writing, because it gives you an indication of his own mentality and his own approach and how he's feeling, but it also kind of makes him a strange voice for all of media covering Palestine and the Gaza Strip and the whole occupation period back in the 90s and early 2000s. Kind of approached it in the same way. It was almost normal to be that extremely kind of battered and bruised and arrested and plagued by all this thing. It was a normalcy. And his approach to it gets that across, is that this is life. This is nothing new and unique. I want new and unique next. And he's interviewing lots of people, and he's quite, he's being quite fast and loose with his words and the narration. Far too meek and terrified in reality to do it physically in front of people. But in his narration, there's a kind of different Joe Sacco, and it is written differently to his other books. So certainly if you've read his other books, this reads very differently. But ultimately, it was quite an interesting thing. But it did start off quite jarring, because it took me a while to get in to the mentality and the rhythm of what he was saying and how he was saying it. That aside, all of the stories of the people that he meet are harrowing beyond belief. And the one really intriguing thing about all this book is that he tries to approach all of these different things. He's almost got a list of things that he wants to talk about, and different members of the community that he wants to talk to try and understand, to try and get this broad scope of life. The art style as well is, I mentioned this about another book that I talked about recently, it's disarming, his art style is, because it's quite overwhelmingly caricature style, big lips, big heads, really accentuated emotion. So if people are screaming or if people are angry, it's times 10. It's really ramped up in terms of the art style. And what that does is it almost kind of disarms you. So when those really impactful words or moments come, it hits a bit harder, because you are met with this kind of caricature-like world that doesn't seem real, but then you kind of know it's real when you read it. You know it's based in reality. And then when some of the really tragic, horrible stories hit, it really disarms you, I think, the artwork, and it really does, and it really is very creative. And for this book, it's chaotic in all good ways, because even the lettering and stuff like that, and the letter boxes and narration boxes are just chaotically strewn around the page to kind of give that emphasis of, this is just madness. There's so many different opinions, so many different things happening. And so where does it go, essentially? It starts off by, him coming from Egypt, him going into Gaza, him trying to find out, what life in Gaza is like. He tries to find, people, survivors from 1948 and from that big movement of people that was initiated then. And he tries to talk to them and find out their opinions on how that happened. but equally he tries to find out, you know, how Israeli soldiers and police the area, because again, it's a very different Palestine that this is based in now. Things have changed in terms of, you know, the walling and the structure of Gaza has changed, but you still get an idea of that relationship between a Palestinian and an Israeli, and the build, and it even goes into how that started, you know, that first big conflict between them, you know, in the refugee camps and areas. But one of the amazing things that comes across really quickly, I think, is how every Palestinian he meets wants their story to be heard. They want to put it out there because they are so desperate for someone to help and someone to justify their suffering in some way and to change something. So they're all so gracious and generous at bringing Joe into his house, giving him tea, constantly bursting with tea by the end of every chapter, to be fair. And they just giving him anything, you know, food, whatever. I mean, and these people have got next to nothing. He visits, you know, a refugee camp that within like 2 square kilometers, you know, there's 65,000 people living. But yeah, he eats well, he drinks well, he sleeps in the best bed, you know, because they want him to serve a purpose. They want him to get that word out there to the international community and try and change things. Joe feels a lot of pressure in doing that as well, and he tries to, you know, moderate their expectations of him. He almost goes too far in many ways in trying to understand every layer of society within Palestine and within the Gaza Strip mainly. You know, there's one chapter, for example, that goes into the hijab, you know, why women wear it and their opinions on it, because in this list that he must have had, I'm sure it mentions somewhere in the book that he had a list to go through of what he wanted to achieve and who he wanted to interview and the type of places he wants to go to. You know, that, their style of dress and how they have tea and how they go about their recreational activities, if anything, how they're educated, you know, what they do with a day, what the kids are like. So he wants to get kids' opinions as well as old people's opinions. It's massive. His ambition within that 2-month period is big. It is really big. And I think the book itself does a very good job in capturing it. Some areas I felt like I wanted to go deeper into, but then other areas I felt justified the shortness. The devastating poverty of life in this area comes across super well in the art and the writing and everything, and there's no avoiding it really, because this book, you can argue that it is from a Palestinian's point of view and it is taking Palestinian stories, and so you could quite, you know, conceivably construct an argument saying, oh, Joe Sacco's just taken that one person's opinion and turned it into fact. But he is a journalist with integrity, to be fair, and all I've read and all I understand about him is that he will outline that story, but equally he wouldn't just, you know, feature a story that he knows outright is untrue. He'll feature stories that, you know, he would have interviewed countless people in this 2-month period, and if one interview is kind of representative of many that he's done, then he will use that to depict that story. And so it's not as if he's found one person and gone with, right, that's the reality. He shows many different Palestinians, many different opinions on, you know, being taken captive and held captive and stuff like that. And they've all got different experiences and slants on it. And ultimately, I do think journalistically, you know, it has got a bit of integrity about it. Although you could argue that, you know, his approach is open to be exploited in a way, because if you are meeting a journalist and someone is telling you that story and you are going through that story with them, then they are going to ramp it up a bit and they are going to accentuate it up a bit. And it's on Joe then to kind of mediate that, try and do as much research and as much kind of cross-journalism as possible to try and get to the reality of it. And I do think that for the most part, he does a good job in doing that. Like, I don't finish the book thinking Palestinians are angels and Israelis are demons. Not at all. I finished this book with more of an understanding how complex the situation is and how deep-rooted the pain and struggle is on both sides, and how hard it's going to be for both to kind of coexist in many ways. This book showcases the Palestinians' plight and a lot of things like that. But then there are other books that show the Israeli plight and things like that. And it's only when you put the two on an equal level that you can then go forward from it. And that's why this book is so good, I think, of equalising the playing field and presenting a visual record of life and people's stories within that area. Not an easy read at all, but a worthwhile read, I think, and certainly well worth looking into if you are, like me, very kind of, politically and socially aware of the current Middle Eastern situation and Israel and Palestine situation. It helps to put things into perspective and order, but don't just read one thing. Read loads. Read loads from all different perspectives. That's what I do, and that's what I'm going to keep doing. And hopefully you will find some sort of way of equalising everyone and moving forward from that. But anyway, that's enough of me waffling on. Thank you very much for watching. I will catch you on the next one.